Professor Anand Singh anthropology के professor हैं. I think it's called KwaZulu Zulu University of Natal in KwaZulu University of Durban. उनसे निवेदन करता हूँ कि वो अपना वक्तव्य दें. I am speaking in Hindi. Please, Professor Anand Singh from Durban, please give your intervention. And my request will be take no more than 10 minutes because we are running very short of time. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm very much in agreement with what Mahatma Gandhi had said with respect to language. When he was living in Johannesburg, he used to have very heated conversations with Mr. Pollack, who lived with him in the rented house that Gandhiji had taken. And one thing that he had emphasized to Mr. Pollack was that people should be taught in their own respective languages so that they could serve their localities, principalities, and countries in the best ways they can through their own languages. But Mr. Pollack, being the Englishman that he was, in many ways disagreed with Gandhiji. They often got into very serious, heated discussions with respect to this language issue, and Gandhiji made it clear with him that he would not change his mind. He was, however, unable to ascertain whether Mr. Pollack had accepted that Gandhiji's view was a fair and a strong one based upon what he felt a sense of commitment to, or whether he just gave up thinking about Gandhiji as a stubborn man. But having said that, though, what is important about Gandhiji's stay in Johannesburg was that he had only just went there, settled down, and began to familiarize himself with the environment and the people around him. It was around this time, in 1906, that the Zulu rebellion actually broke out, the Bambata rebellion. Now, for me as a person of Indian origin living in South Africa, I see something a little bit more than what the literature tends to convey to us. And that is, the Bambata rebellion arose out of a protest that was imposed upon them, a form that was based on a taxation that was imposed upon them. And they needed to fight against it. Now, why is this important for me as a person of Indian origin and somebody who has an interest in religion as well, in history as well, apart from religion, of course? It stems from the idea of what I am as a human being of Indian origin, having strong links and sentimentalities with India, and having survived conversion attempt after conversion attempt by people of different faiths. Gandhiji, in many ways, represents a mentality that certainly conveys the strength and perseverance that Hindus have borne over the generations. And that lesson came to him at a very opportune moment, something that most human beings would not be able to appreciate and commit themselves to when confronted with this. Now, when Gandhiji was just about settling down in Johannesburg, the breakout of this war, or not necessarily a war, but the protests by the Zulus against colonial imposition of this taxation, was something that he tended to understand because he came from India, witnessed English arrogance, and was aware of the rising tide against British attitudes in India and the need for them to start preparing to leave that land. So what was important here was that Gandhiji understood, from the way I see it, the reasons for the Zulus objecting to that taxation. In most instances, in the colony of Natal, Zulus were generally contented subsistence agriculturalists and pastoralists. They did not integrate themselves into the colonial economy, and they were happy being away from it. Now, very interestingly, the urge and the call to bring indentured labor to South Africa actually began in 1951, late 1950s to early 1951. It took about 9 years before this agreement was concluded and then effected by having the first shipload of Indians brought into Durban, which was then Port Natal. Now, why was this important? It was because when Zulus were hired by the white colonialists, they did not understand the meaning of a contract, were not interested in it because the treatment that they were given by the colonists was extremely harsh, and they had to find ways of vacating those positions as quickly as they could. Now, the colonists, on the other hand, realized that some of the most pliable people they could have working in the sugar estates and in the colonial old land was people from India. And Indians came to some extent, if I may use the quotation from Professor Kailash Nath Sharma, who was my guest in 1992 when I convened the anthropology conference here in Durban. He wrote a paper which was unpublished, and I'm inclined to believe what he actually said, because I don't believe Indians willingly left India to come to South Africa, knowing the kind of harsh treatment they got from the British while they were still there as colonial administrators. Professor Sharma said that the Indians were conned, cajoled, and coerced into coming into South Africa. And I'm inclined to believe that, because having lived through apartheid as well, I know what the situation would have been. Nobody would want to willingly go into a situation that was so politically and economically exploitative. Now, having said that, when the Indians first came, they worked in the farms and virtually quadrupled the production in less than 12 months. There was something like 25,000 tons of sugarcane produced by the British farmers up to the year 1860. But when the Indian indentured laborers came in, they produced up to 100,000 tons of sugarcane in less than 12 months. That not only constituted a significant surge in production, but also led to a strong willingness to bring more Indians into the colony of Natal. Why is this important? They continued to encourage more and more Indians to come into Natal because they realized the agricultural capacities of the soil conditions here in the province of Natal. Now, this swiftly changed by the late 1880s when Indians started making tremendous inroads into the white economy and radically changing the economic statuses in that area. So much so that there's been a tremendous backlash against the Indians. If I may fast track into the early 1900s, the imposition of the taxation of the Zulus was largely to try and stop indentured labor from coming into South Africa, to stop the Indians because they became too economically and politically competitive against their white counterparts. The result was that they had to now start drawing labor into the colonial economy. And Gandhiji had already noticed this. And when they decided, that is, the Zulus decided to protest against the taxation, he understood why. And he wrote in his Experiments of Truth, his sympathies lied with the Zulus. But his loyalties lied with the British because he considered himself a British citizen. Now, herein, I think, came a very strong motivation on the part of Gandhiji to start rethinking his lifestyle. Having married, had his children, engaged in legal representation on behalf of certain clients here in Durban, and he began to review his own life situation. It was virtually a watershed moment for him when he decided from Johannesburg that he had to go and participate in that rebellion. It was not a war, but a rebellion that the Zulus had decided against the British because they did not want to be integrated into the colonial economy. What transpired subsequently to this was that Gandhiji left Johannesburg. There were many other Indians already there. They were not really welcome because gold was a significant aspect of the wealth in that part of the country. And very importantly, at this particular day, Johannesburg and the surrounding areas actually provide 75% of South Africa's wealth, a very small region producing most of its wealth. Gandhiji had to actually leave that, and Natal, for what it is, coming from Johannesburg to Natal, was generally very savanna type of vegetation. He had sent some of his stuff over, sent his wife Kasturbai back to what is now called the Gandhi Ashram, which is like about 20 minutes or half an hour's drive from where I live. It was an interesting place. He sent his wife back there, went and registered, and he was very welcomed by the British, who generally did not like him because he was considered to be a political agitator. He liked what he was doing, but he seriously considered the context in which he was actually going to review his participation in the struggles that the Indians were facing in Durban and Indians were facing in India itself. And he realized, and a thought actually dawned upon him, as he himself explained, that he cannot give his best to the struggle against exploitation, racial, economic, and political, unless he detaches himself from marriage, family, and the need for any kind of material accumulation. On his way to Durban, he continuously thought about adopting brahmacharya. And that in itself became far more meaningful to him and no more an exaggerated, glorified aspect of life that was written in Hindu scriptures. He began to see it, as he himself explained, more vividly because he realized that he had to begin to backtrack from the normal state of life that he lived if he had to make a success of contributing positively towards the political struggle in Durban and India. Please let me know when I have 2 minutes left so that I'll know how to time myself, sir, Mr. Bajaj. Right? So in this context, what Gandhiji had done was register himself. The very people who were boisterously and arrogantly against him actually found his presence very positive to the struggle that they had to face against the Zulu rebellion. Gandhiji had noted one thing, that Natal was very sparsely populated. He had to visit Zulu communities that were very sparsely spread out in the province, and it gave him a tremendous amount of time to reflect upon brahmacharya. And he realized that that was now going to be his route in life. He had taken that and he realized one thing, that his sympathies lied with the Zulus because their grievance against the British was a legitimate one. And very importantly, no Zulus had been injurious towards Indians at all. The result was that he had decided he was going to think more deeply about it, and that he was going to dedicate more of his life towards service on a community basis. Are you going to announce something, sir? Am I okay with time?
Yeah, please try to wind up.
Okay, thanks. So Gandhi had realized that going into brahmachari was one step towards establishing himself for the latter stage of celibacy. He discussed it with the people that were immediately around him, and he decided that he will actually openly declare brahmachari by making sure that he no longer enjoyed any private moments with his wife, with his family, and started adopting all those around him as part of his extended family. That was an extremely important moment for him. But very importantly, for us here living as a minority in Durban, at that particular historical juncture, Gandhiji saw Zulus as friendlies. He certainly did not see any sense of enmity or anti-Indianness amongst them. And for that reason, he positively contributed towards treating the wounds of the Zulus. He made it clear that their rebellion was not akin to a war. It was not a war, but a rebellion. And at the outset, what he did experience was that there was no sign of a rebellion because the people were so sparsely distributed in the province. But what was important for him, though, was that he had to render a service to the Zulus because whites were not prepared to treat the Zulus for the wounds that they had. What he experienced in his voluntary service and the 24 men that he had assisting him as part of his ambulance corps was that they appreciated him, even though they were initially very much against him and were generally rude towards him. They gave him a temporary status of sergeant major. And with that status, he was able to move around freely. But what was very contributory towards neutralizing the attitudes of whites towards him was that when they saw they could not receive medical attention from anyone else, Gandhiji was there for them to give them prescriptions for the medication that they actually needed. What happened was that the enmity and the aggression towards Zulus as well also began to lessen because they realized the very neutral place that Gandhiji had found for himself and rendered a service that was neither for the British nor for the Zulus alone. He was a loyal member of the empire, but there are similarities, if you don't mind my introducing here, and it might be far-fetched, and I'm willing to accept criticisms against this. It reminds me of the battle that Arjuna faced on the battlefield himself, when he did not want to kill his brethren on the battlefield. And Sri Krishna insisted that he had to do his duty. In the same way, when Swami Vivekananda also went to Sri Ramakrishna, he never understood his role when he first met Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. But what was important for Swami Vivekananda at that early stage. So in this sense, what we see in Mahatma Gandhi was an attempt to use Hindu scriptures to ensure that he led the struggle in ways that he understood best. I find myself, as a person of Indian origin, at a tremendous disadvantage, not being fluent in my language. But unfortunately, only English is spoken in the part of the world that I come from. I wish I could speak Hindi better than I actually write it. But having said this, I find this part of Gandhiji's life very inspirational. and the decisions that he took were unique to the purpose for which he was born in life. And I do see him really as a patriot, as much as, and I will end with this, that I have serious problems and strong opinions on the interference he engaged with, on the interference he had in the Congress party when he made Jawaharlal Nehru gave Jawaharlal Nehru the superior position to Vallabhbhai Patel in the Congress party. And we all know what a mess it actually landed us up into in the last 70 odd years. But that's a topic for another discussion. But with respect to his role here in Durban, it was most certainly acts of not only patriotism, but genuine spirituality as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Anand Singh, for a very, very significant intervention. May I request you to send this, what you have spoken on email. We will use it for our proceedings. Thank you very much for your intervention. I will now request Professor Vidyut Chakravarti. I am sorry I have kept you waiting. Please make your intervention and make it as brief as possible given the pressure on time. We will certainly hold another meeting sometime and we will discuss it in longer detail.
नमस्कार, आनंद साहब का जो बात मैंने सुनी, उसका बाद तो मेरा जो कहना था वो थोड़ा पर्सपेक्टिव मिल गया। पहले तो मैं बजाज साहब और श्रीनिवास साहब को धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूं, क्योंकि इतना अच्छा किताब लिखा, जिस किताब का टाइटल मेरे को बहुत अच्छा लगा, द मेकिंग ऑफ ए हिंदू पेट्रियट। मेरा जो चर्चा का विषय होगा, गांधी वाज ए पेट्रियट हु वाज आल्सो ए नेशनलिस्ट। मतलब हिंदू वाला शब्द मैं बाद में ले आना चाहता हूं। तो गांधी जी का जो आदर्श था, वो आदर्श का साथ शायद ये टाइटल का थोड़ा सा तालमेल ठीक से नहीं बैठ पाएगा। देखिए, मैं पहले शुरू करूंगा, अंबेडकर साहब का एक स्टेटमेंट था जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबली में अंबेडकर साहब कहा 1949 25 नवंबर, जो लास्ट स्पीच था अंबेडकर साहब का है ना, गांधी जी का जो मूल्यांकन हम लोग ठीक ठाक नहीं कर पाया कि गांधी जी को हम लोग बाबा कर दिया, गांधी जी को हमने भगवान बना दिया। तो ज्यादातर जो डिस्कशन होता था उस टाइम, अभी भी होता है, गांधी जी को हम भगवान जैसा सोचता है। इसी हिसाब से मैं श्रीनिवास साहब और बजाज साहब को फिर आभार व्यक्त करता हूं, क्योंकि गांधी जी इंसान थे, जो इंसान का एक्स्ट्राऑर्डिनरी क्वालिटी था, इसीलिए गांधी से गांधी जी बना। ये बात मेरा पहले पॉइंट है। दूसरी पॉइंट है, मेरे हिसाब से गांधी जी एक आदर्श, मतलब गांधी जी रिप्रेजेंट्स एन आइडियोलॉजी। दूसरी बात है, गांधी जी का जो कर्म पद्धति, ये है एक प्रक्रिया, जो प्रक्रिया उस टाइम हिंदुस्तान में लोगों ने अपनाया, उसी हिसाब से हिंदुस्तान का आजादी मिला और ज्यादा लोगों को जोड़ पाया। तो इसलिए इसको जो इफेक्टिवनेस, वो भी उस टाइम प्रूव हो गया। और तीसरी बात कह रहे हैं, देखिए आज 2021 में भी हम लोग गांधी जी के बारे में चर्चा कर रहे हैं। आनंद जी जुलू रेवलियन का रेलिवेंस भी बताया था। उसका मतलब गांधी जी आज भी उसी तरह प्रासंगिक है, मतलब गांधी जी कंटिन्यूज टू रिमेन रेलेवेंट। एंड ऑन दैट बेसिस मैं एक आर्गुमेंट देना चाहता हूं कि गांधी जी इज ट्रांसेंडेंटल। अगर साउथ अफ्रीका में आनंद जी बैठे हुए, वहां पे जितना रेलिवेंट है, हिंदुस्तान में हम लोग जहाँ पे बैठे हैं वहां पे भी ऐसा ही रेलिवेंट है। ये मेरा दूसरा पॉइंट। तीसरा पॉइंट मैं ये बताना चाहता हूं कि गांधी जी को समझने के लिए, गांधी जी का जो कोलीग थे, गांधी के साथ जो एक साथ आजादी का लड़ाई लड़े, उसका भी बात थोड़ा करना चाहिए, क्योंकि मेरे हिसाब से गांधी जी इज ए क्रिएटिव ब्लेंडिंग ऑफ सेवरल आइडियाज। जो आइडियाज गांधी जी ने पाया एम.एन. रॉय साहब से, जो आइडिया गांधी जी ने पाया रविंद्रनाथ टैगोर से, जो आइडिया गांधी जी ने पाया बी.आर. अम्बेडकर साहब से। इसलिए मैं कहता हूं, जो उस जमाने में आज जिस तरह झगड़ा होता है, उस तरह झगड़ा नहीं होता था। वो झगड़ा होता था, झगड़ा का जो आउटकम वो था थोड़ा क्रिएटिव थिंकिंग। इसलिए गांधी जी का सोच में, जैसे मान लीजिए ह्यूमैनिज्म, गांधी जी का ह्यूमैनिज्म का ज्यादातर लिया गया रविंद्रनाथ का ह्यूमैनिज्म से। गांधी जी का जो सोशल जस्टिस का आइडियाज, इसका ज्यादातर लिया गया बी.आर. अम्बेडकर साहब का विचारधारा से। तो इसलिए मैं जो तीसरा पॉइंट कहना चाहता हूं कि गांधी जी इज ए कॉम्बिनेशन ऑफ द आइडियाज व्हिच ही डिराइव्ड फ्रॉम हिज कोलीग्स हु आल्सो फॉट फॉर national independence. तीसरी बात, चौथी बात जो कहना चाहता हूँ, देखिए मैं राष्ट्र विज्ञान का छात्र हूँ, पॉलिटिकल साइंस मैंने दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय पढ़ाया, अभी एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन में चला रहा हूँ विश्व भारती का कुलपति होने के नाते। तो वो मैंने देखा कि सबसे जो इम्पोर्टेंट टेक्स्ट जो गांधी जी ने साउथ अफ्रीका में जब रहते थे, जब वॉयज मतलब समुद्र में लिवरपूल से डरबन आ रहे थे, तब जो किताब लिखा, जो किताब है हिंद स्वराज, ये जो हिंद स्वराज का किताब मेरे हिसाब से गांधी जी को समझने के लिए, गांधी जी बाबा नहीं, गांधी जी एक आदर्श, एक विचारधारा इसी तरह समझने के लिए मेरे हिसाब से हिंद स्वराज सबसे गुरुत्वपूर्ण बुकलेट है और ग्रंथ है, आप कह सकते हैं। इसमें भी 2-3 पॉइंट मैं जिक्र करूंगा क्योंकि टाइम मेरा ज्यादा नहीं है। एक पॉइंट है, गांधी जी ऑलवेज ही यूज्ड टू इंट्रोस्पेक्ट, जैसा जुलू रेबेलियन के बारे में आनंद जी बहुत अच्छा एक्सप्लेनेशन दिया। मेरे हिसाब से हिंदुस्तान कैसे ब्रिटिश का कब्जा हुआ, इसके बारे में बहुत अच्छे एक्सप्लेनेशन गांधी जी ने दिया। इसीलिए मेरे हिसाब से आज भी हिंदुस्तानियों को अपना विचार, अपना जो आदर्श, इसके बारे में इंट्रोस्पेक्ट, आत्म समालोचना करना चाहिए। गांधी जी क्या कहा, देखिए हिंद स्वराज को अगर कोट किया जाए, ये जो कंपनी, ये कंपनी को हमने लाया, ये कंपनी को हमने लाया, हमने अपना हिसाब से जो स्वार्थ सिद्धि करने के लिए ये कंपनी बहादुर को लाया। ये कंपनी बहादुर हम लोगों को कब्जा ऐसे नहीं किया, अगर हम लोग मदद नहीं करते तो शायद ब्रिटिश राज यहाँ पे नहीं आते। तो इसका मतलब है गांधी जी देखिए, इंस्टेड ऑफ ब्लेमिंग अदर्स, he wanted us ourselves to introspect and find out the solution। आज भी ऐसा ही चल रहा है, हिंदुस्तान में इतना मारामारी, इतना लड़ाई, इतना विभाजन, ये भी आज भी हिंदुस्तान में आगे बढ़ने के लिए एक मेरे हिसाब से एक डेटरेंट हो गया। इसलिए जो कहा, जो विचारधारा गांधी जी 1909 में दिया, वो आज 2021 में भी पूरी मेरे हिसाब से प्रासंगिक है। दूसरी बात जो कह रहे हैं, आजकल जो पैंडेमिक का जमाना में, हमें लगता है ये भी गांधी जी का जो सोच, ये भी हम लोगों को दोबारा सोचना चाहिए। गांधी जी रेलवे के बारे में बहुत क्रिटिसिज्म किया, गांधी जी रेलवे के खिलाफ था, ये सब लोग जानते हैं, हिंद स्वराज में इसका डिटेल विवरण दिया। लेकिन मैं सोचता हूँ जो उस जमाने में गांधी जी जो कहा, आज भी हम लोग वही जो प्रक्रिया, वही जो मतलब मेथड, वही जो सिस्टम, वही अपनाने की कोशिश कर रहा है। गांधी जी का जो कहना था कि रेलवे बंद कर दो, क्योंकि रेलवे सबसे खतरनाक चीज है, क्योंकि रेलवे के बजाय प्लेग एक जगह से दूसरे जगह ट्रेवल कर रहा है। क्यों कह रहे हैं, जो प्लेग से अफेक्टेड बंदा है, वो अगर रेलगाड़ी में बैठे, बहुत जल्दी हिंदुस्तान के कई कोने कोने पहुंच सकता था। इसलिए गांधी जी कहा रेलवे उस टाइम बंद कर देना चाहिए। देखिए आज 2020 और 2021 में जब ये पैंडेमिक हम लोग सबको काबू कर दिया, इस दौरान भी हम लोग वही सोच रहा है, जैसे कैसे इंसान को एक जगह में रखना चाहिए, इसीलिए रेलवे बंद कर दिया, हमने फ्लाइट बंद कर दिया। तो मेरे हिसाब से लोग जो कहते थे उस टाइम कि गांधी जी वाज थिंकिंग बैकवर्ड, गांधी जी वाज ट्राइंग टू टेक अस टू द डेज ऑफ बुलक कार्ट। लेकिन देखिए कितना उसका फोरसाइट, उसी 1909 में जो कहा गया, वही प्रक्रिया, वही पद्धति हम लोग आज 2021 में हम लोग लागू कर रहे हैं। ये एक बात है। दूसरी बात है, मेडिकल साइंस के बारे में गांधी जी का बहुत ही स्ट्रॉन्ग क्रिटिसिज्म था। ये हिंद स्वराज अगर पढ़िए तो देखेंगे गांधी जी कह रहे हैं कि मेडिकल साइंस का बहुत खिलाफ था। अगर आज हम सोचे तो कहेंगे भाई गांधी जी तो बेवकूफ थे, क्योंकि मेडिकल साइंस बहुत जरूरी था। लेकिन अगर अंदर में उसमें जाए तो आपको पता चलेगा गांधी जी का सोच यही था कि मेडिकल साइंस में क्या होता है। मान लीजिए आप जो गांधी एग्जाम्पल दिया, हम लोग शादी ब्याह में जब जाते हैं, ज्यादा खाना खाते हैं नॉर्मली, खाना खाने के बाद अगर पेट में कुछ खराबी लगे तो मुझे पता है कि डॉक्टर के पास जाए, डॉक्टर दवाई दे देंगे, हमारा पेट ठीक हो जाएगा। तो गांधी जी कह रहे हैं कि ये जो कॉन्फिडेंस बिल्डिंग, ये मेडिकल साइंस ने किया। कह रहे हैं अगर मेडिकल साइंस नहीं रहते तो क्या होता। गांधी कह रहे तब इंसान अपना सेल्फ अकाउंटेबिलिटी, अपना आपको बारे में सोचने मजबूर हो जाता, तो शायद कम खाते। इस तरह कई एग्जाम्पल गांधी जी दिया। तो मेरे हिसाब से देखिए मेडिकल साइंस के बारे में भी गांधी जी का जो सोच, वो सोच हम लोग आज भी कर रहे हैं। हम लोग देखिए सेल्फ अकाउंटेबिलिटी प्रैक्टिस करने के लिए खाना बहुत कम करते हैं, हम लोग वॉक वगैरह करते रहते हैं। तो इसीलिए मैं कहता हूँ कि गांधी जी का जो सोच उस दौरान दिया गया था 1909 में, वो आज भी प्रासंगिक है। इसीलिए जो ये मेरा बात सुन रहे हैं, और मैं बजाज जी और श्रीनिवास जी को भी रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा, ये हिंद स्वराज के बारे में एक अच्छा सा चर्चा होना चाहिए, क्योंकि हिंद स्वराज आज भी इसी तरह प्रासंगिक है। और मेरा लास्ट जो बात मैं खत्म करूंगा, गांधी जी का पूरा जो सोच, एक उर्दू शायर का शेर सुना के मैं खत्म करूंगा। कर्म अच्छा है तो किस्मत दासी है, कर्म अच्छा है तो किस्मत दासी है, नियत सही है, नियत सही है तो घर मदीना काशी है। यही गांधी जी। धन्यवाद।
Thank you, Professor Vidyut Chakrabarty. I'm sorry that we rushed you and promise you that we'll hold a more detailed meeting, more relaxed meeting when we'll have longer presentation. On Hind Swaraj, we did a very authentic edition in multiple languages of Hind Swaraj. And this book actually is an outgrowth from what we did for Hind Swaraj.